Hey there, I'm Lezli Levine-Harvell. Welcome to Impolite Conversation, the podcast, curated by the Iconoclast Dinner Experience. I believe the best way to explore a topic in depth is to view it through multiple lenses. Join us as we explore race, culture, and societal issues through the lens of industry experts, writers, cultural critics, and HBCU students. Thanks so much for joining us for IDE Impolite Conversation. I'm your host, Dr. Lezli Levine-Harvell, and we're continuing our journey through race as a social construct. Here at Impolite Conversation, we like to take a topic and give our listeners multiple and unique perspectives to consider. We kicked off this theme talking with journalist Yashika Dutt, author of Coming Out Dalit, who was born in India into a formerly untouchable caste, but passed as Brahmin for many years before coming out. And she also shared how the caste system is really made up of nonsense, but to this very day impacts financial and social mobility in India, but also here in the United States, which is very interesting. So if you haven't listened to that episode as of yet, it's fascinating. Go back and take a listen. I'm really excited to continue to explore race as a social construct and how deeply obsessed a society can become with it. And also whiteness hitting differently 20 plus years after its social reckoning. And who better to do that with than someone from South Africa? I'm thrilled to have Dr. Melissa Steyn join us in conversation. Melissa has been developing diversity studies as a field in higher education since starting intercultural and diversity studies at the University of Cape Town in 2001. She is the founding director of the Wits Centre for Diversity Studies, which is at Wits University in Johannnesburg. And since 2014, she has held the South African National Chair in Critical Diversity Studies. She is best known for her publications on whiteness in post-apartheid South Africa. Her MA thesis, written while a Fulbright scholar at Arizona State University, was published as Whiteness Just Isn't What It Used to Be, White Identity in a Changing South Africa, in a series edited by Henry Guru. Hello, Dr. Steyn. I'm so glad to chat with you. Thank you for joining us for Impolite Conversation.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be with you.
So I think most people listening know that generally what South African apartheid was. The British looked at Jim Crow in the US and I'm sure other colonial powers and said, oh, we can do way better than that. But what I don't think most people know is how obsessed the power structure in South Africa was when it came to race. I remember visiting the Apartheid Museum in Johannesburg with my husband. And obviously there were many, many jaw-dropping, mind-blowing historical pieces there that tell the story of South African apartheid. But there were these data points from 1985 that were artfully displayed. And I remember taking a picture of it because it was just so unfathomable to me. But like I said, it was from 1985. And I'll read some of the data. It says more than 1,000 people officially changed color last year. They were reclassified from one race group to another. The Minister of Home Affairs, Mr. Safol Botha, disclosed that during 1985, 702 colored people turned white, 19 whites turned colored, 43 coloreds became Indians, 3 blacks were classified as Malay, no blacks became white, and no whites became black. And I know you as a South African, I was listening to your chat with Rez, our producer, that was really unremarkable to you. But from my point of view, I'll never forget it. I was in my late 20s and I'm like, what am I looking at right now? I had trouble processing what I was looking at and I had so many questions. My first thought was this a special one-time opportunity offered in 1985? It was just unfathomable to me. But it also elucidated how nonsensical all of this is and just the idea that someone's race can be changed by filling out an application. And then also separately, it also just put a fine point on the fact that, you know, he who holds the power creates the social stratifications and decides who is what and can even change it when they feel like it. I know for you, when Rez brought up essentially I think it was the dance of the chameleon or something like that. But for you, that was unremarkable that people would be able to change race.
Well, I'd grown up with it. I was born into apartheid South Africa, and these population registration acts had been in place all my life. When I did my work on whiteness and reading that early whiteness literature in the 1990s, this was the one thing that struck me as the most different about whiteness. in the US and whiteness in South Africa was that growing up as a white person in South Africa, I absolutely knew I was white. You know, people would theorize whiteness and say, you know, sort of like white people don't know they're racialized. They think only black people are racialized. No. In South Africa, you absolutely knew that the way you were classified racially was the most important thing about your life. And as Desmond Tutu said, it determined where you were born, where you would die, and everything in between. So certainly that experience of not knowing that you're racialized absolutely was not the experience of South Africans. So that racial categorization was omnipresent. It was everywhere. And it had very profound consequences because it was actually part of a package deal with a whole lot of other pieces of legislation that had to do with the prohibition of mixed marriages, influx control, which was determining how people could move within the country, pass laws, which were part of that. So black people had to carry passes in order to be in urban areas, and you had to be in the right area at the right time, or else you were really in trouble. There was the Group Areas Act, which determined where you were allowed to live, and all of those worked together as a sort of like a system of interlocking legislation that was pretty tight in terms of determining your life's opportunities and your life experiences along the lines of race.
And so as you talk about legislation, I want to share some of these finer details and timeline to orient folks. So in South Africa, an all-white government was set up in 1948 after decades of forcibly moving Black people to move onto reservations and taking away their land and then methodically taking away their rights. Then in 1950, the Population Registration Act was passed that required everyone to be classified and registered by race. At that time, it was Bantu, or Black Africans, colored, which was a mixed race, and then white. And then later, a fourth category, Asian, which meant Indian and Pakistani, were later added as a separate classification. So this is how obsessed the government was with the preservation of the stratifications, so much so that they set up an office for race classification, and a board was established to oversee that process. And so some of these social characteristics, which I found very interesting, were some things such as where the person lives, the person's friends and acquaintances, employment, socioeconomic status, and even the person's eating and drinking habits. Like, what does that mean? It seems like they continue to make up and add things as they went along.
Sure. The eating and drinking is interesting. Obviously, it was who was allowed in restaurants, in which areas, at one basic level, but also things like alcohol, you know, hard tack, things like whiskey and gin and stuff like that was not allowed to be sold to Black people.
Wait, so just before you go on, I just want to make sure I understand. So if you drank whiskey, that would mean that you are white, or at least not Black.
You were only allowed to buy it if you were white.
So a drinking habit would be like if someone was drinking whiskey would mean that you're white because a Black person would...
so Black people were encouraged to drink beer, you know. Beer
okay.
was, you know, you had a lot of people who brewed their own beer. But it was part of the control. It was also linked into the industry, the beer industry. But it was also just not allowing people to drink the really very intoxicating stuff, you know, to sort of like keep people in check. It was crazy. It was every aspect of life was controlled. But Lezli, I just want to check. Your very first sentence was, what did you say? A white-only government came into power in 1948?
Officially,
but it far preceded that. It started at the end of what we call the Anglo-Boer War, which is now called the South African War. But it was the old Afrikaner groups fighting against British Empire.
And Afrikaners, just so people understand, those are the Dutch.
Mostly Dutch. They were descendants of people from different parts of Europe. There's French and there's German, but it was predominantly Dutch. But after that, we had what was called the Union of South Africa, where they made peace with each other, but it excluded Black people. So that was based on the exclusion of Black people, the establishment of that peace. And the government was white after that. And I think it's really important we start this chronology 1948, 1950, but all of these legislations that had to do with racial control had their predecessors prior to that. So, yeah, we're talking just about apartheid South Africa, but there was a lot of colonial legislation that way preceded that was also racially based. And so after the Union of South Africa, the official policy was racial segregation. It wasn't apartheid, which worked on a philosophy of ethnic groups and dividing the whole country along ethnic groups, and in that way creating a real divide and conquer philosophy for Black people. But before that, there was segregation of Black and white, lines of Black and white. And there was definitely like legislation from the 1920s, for example, that forbade sexual relations between white people and Black people.
Every time I talk to someone who grew up in apartheid South Africa, obviously I'm researching these things, but then they say something that really is just so profound. Like the idea that whiskey was for whites, beer was for Blacks, and there was actually a law that supposedly had a rationale as to why this was okay. So, Melissa, I know professionally and intellectually, you're obviously well-versed in the policies of apartheid. But I want to chat a bit about you personally. So you left South Africa in 1994 and you returned in 1996. You said you felt like Rip Van Winkle. And to orient everyone, Nelson Mandela was released from prison in February of 1990, and negotiations to end apartheid formally began that year. The negotiations lasted for 4 years, and then Mandela is elected as president. So you're a white woman, you grew up in South Africa, apartheid South Africa, you leave in 94, you return in 96. What is that like for you?
It was an extraordinary experience because I left South Africa just shortly, like a month after our elections, when the ANC came into power. After coming back, and in that period after coming back from the States, I said to myself, anyone who doesn't understand what social construction means needs to live through a period of such profound change like South Africa went through, because you could really see it had all been based on one set of constructions of reality. And, shortly after that, you can have a society that's functioning from completely different assumptions. I left for the States in June. So you must know it was a very uncertain time, a lot of anxiety in the air, as you can imagine.
So you were like a full adult. What was your anxiety about?
Within the white population generally, you must know that the racist background in this country had always been filtered through narratives of apocalypse. And that goes right back to the 1700s. This idea that the country was going to go up in flames because there was going to be some sort of racial conflagration, going to be a racial war, which, as you know, is part of the racist imagination. This looming threat of racial conflict, always. And it always has worked, and it still works this way, that every time there's any kind of change, there's a lot of alarm around that period. But you must know that we had been brought up as white South Africans, and I do want to tell you, I was the child of a person who was in the opposition. My father was opposed to apartheid, but it was still a very white upbringing.
So you were raised in a house that was in opposition to apartheid. I just want to make sure I understand, because I'm not necessarily like the Nationalist Party
was the apartheid government. That's right. Okay. I was raised in a home where both my parents were Afrikaners, but they were mavericks in the sense that they did not approve of Afrikaner nationalism and they did not support apartheid. The big fear had always been, what will happen if Black people take over? It's going to be the end of the country, and who knows what they will do to us, which of course makes sense when you think about it, that it's quite rational to imagine that if you've been ill-treating people for 400 years, that they might actually not be nice to you. So there was a lot of that anxiety. And also you must know, and this I realized increasingly in the late 1980s, early 1990s, that a lot of that fear was because we actually didn't know Black people. which might seem crazy to you because we'd always had Black people working in our homes, nannies, domestic servants, gardeners. So there'd always been a great deal of that kind of contact. But the only kind of knowledge that we actually had was all these crazy stereotypes that our heads had been pumped full of, and predominantly fear. But we actually just didn't know Black people. We didn't know anything real about how Black people thought, how they felt, even understanding Black cultural spaces that weren't just a whole lot of silly, superstitious, stereotypical rubbish. So I realized around about the late 1980s, early 1990s, that this was what was provoking a lot of anxiety, is that white people, were realizing they were going to have to go into a future with people that how could they trust Black South Africa when they didn't actually know anything other than a lot of rubbish that had been pumped into their heads. So I think there was a lot of that kind of anxiety, which is why in communication studies there was this concept of disconfirmed expectations, which is when, the things that you expect don't happen. And obviously it could be disappointment, but it can also work the other way, which is that amazing feeling when you expect something terrible and then it doesn't happen. And it's this huge sort of like elation. And so that also definitely was part of the Rainbow Nation after 1994. That sense that actually we had been led into a transition that was averting this civil war that had always been predicted. But you must know all the stereotypes about Black people. It's Black men are so violent and all of those things. Our heads were all full of that kind of nonsense.
I want to just understand things through your eyes. So you're Rip Van Winkle. When I think about Rip Van Winkle, I think about Captain America, like people who have been in the ice. They've been in the ice, they wake up and they're like, what is this? So for you, if you could name just 3 things that completely change your worldview.
So I went away when nothing material had changed on the ground. I come back and the first thing I go to do, obviously, is to go and shop to buy some provisions. And the people who are serving in the shops and in our post office behind the counters and that are not white. Which before, when I tell you that there had been those cluster of laws, another one was job reservation. So only white people did those jobs that interfaced with white people like that. And I come back and it's sort of like, oh my God. And what was totally fabulous to see was the confidence of these, although I was thinking specifically of young Black people who stepped into these positions and were, just, stepping into them and as if there was nothing strange about it. But coming from the old white South Africa, it was extraordinary.
And it was 2 years ago. It was 2 years. You leave for 2 years, you come back. And
I came back and it was an extraordinary experience how much had changed in that time. I'll tell you another example. So my mother, as I tell you, she was an Afrikaner. They had a post-apartheid, but she was deeply Afrikaans.
Meaning, like, what does that mean?
Well, she spoke Afrikaans, her language, although she was completely bilingual with English, but the church that she had attended as a child had been part of that apartheid system. The church had preached that people were of different species and that we were God's chosen people here in Africa and all that sort of stuff that white people have told themselves, in various contexts, not only here. But I come back and so my mom was an asthmatic. All right. And she, for about 4 days over that election period, she was so ill she could not breathe. And I mean, that was just the anxiety. And I come back from the States and there's my mom watching TV and she tells me that her favorite TV program is People of the South, which was hosted by Oliver Tambo's son, Dolly Tambo. And he's her favorite presenter.
And 2 years ago, that would not have been...
Well, he might have been back in the country by 1994. But I mean, they'd all been in exile.
Just to contextualize people, Oliver Tambo
He was the leader of the ANC, which we'd been taught were terrorists.
So just to give people context, your mother, who was deeply Afrikaans, grew up going to the church, even though she was opposed to it. You know, there's a part of her spirituality and the cultural norms that are continuing to perpetuate these social stratifications. You leave, you come back, and her favorite television host is a quote unquote terrorist.
Yes, the son of the most dangerous.
Okay, got it.
terrorist.
Yes,
the most
got
dangerous.
it. Okay. I remember one of the things that you had mentioned. Obviously, apartheid it's almost like the legalizing and institutionalizing of whiteness. Like if you think about it in that way, that's what it is, right?
Well, white supremacy.
Or just whiteness as an ideology, as in not necessarily a race, but an ideology in the sense that if there's a social stratification, white is here. And now we're going to institutionalize this whiteness through apartheid or white supremacy. Apartheid, we can call it white, But one of the things that you said that was so fascinating to me is that you said when apartheid ended, whiteness got found out. What do you mean by that? That it got found out?
So, Lezli, it's not only about institutionalizing it, it's also about enforcing it. When you talk about that apartheid system or the white supremacist system here in South Africa, I mean, it's being prepared to put violence behind it, which I think is really important for us to remember. And people often say that South Africa had a peaceful transition, but they forget that there was a 30-year-long war that was fought on our borders. So it was our neighboring states that carried that burden of the war. It was kept on the outside of South Africa. And I think that's really important to say that, because it's not as if people didn't lose their lives fighting for their freedom in this country. A lot of people did. Sorry, I just had to say that because I think it's really important, because it's a misrepresentation to think that this was just a peaceful handing over of power. I mean, white South Africa fought tooth and nail to prevent it. And it was only when the writing was completely on the wall that white South Africa started entering into those negotiations. And I think that's important to raise that. And now I've forgotten what your question was.
You said that whiteness got found out. So what
Yes.
do you mean by found out?
In countries like the US,
Canada,
Australia,
probably.
Canada, places that you could call like deep colonial states, and even Europe, the idea that white people somehow carry the norms of what are the proper ways of being human are able to be perpetuated. And the violence, it may not be the kind of violence that we had in this country, but the violence that nevertheless is part of holding a racially stratified society in place, operates almost like invisibly and silently most of the time, And I think what happened with South Africa, and I think it's true for Germany too, after the Second World War, is that where other countries could go on pretending that somehow whiteness, it hadn't actually been a system, a violent system, and it's somehow just part of a natural order, and that somehow white people just tend to rise to the top by virtue of merit and all of those sorts of things. All those narratives that inform whiteness and societies where whiteness is dominant were blown open, because, like I tell you, suddenly black people on television that are profound and immensely articulate and, sort of like outperform white people. We've got rugby players that are now like the best we've had. We've got cricket players that are like the best we've had. We've got black people who've become leading nuclear scientists and mathematicians and AI engineers. And so those lies of whiteness are completely exposed. And the sense of entitlement that goes with being white is profoundly problematized now in this country. It's not, things don't just happen in that way that seems to be sort of like just by virtue of the way the world works. You can really see that there's engineering that went into creating a white supremacist country.
I have a question. There's a phrase that you used, or I think it might have been a law. You said a job reservation system.
Yes.
What is that?
It was a system that was introduced again with the Union of South Africa shortly after 1910. I'm not sure of the exact date, but the best jobs were all reserved for white people. And black people could only do the jobs that were, manual and were there to support white people who could do the jobs that earned money and gave you prestige and reputation and all
So
those
that was an
sorts of things.
actual law.
Oh, absolutely. And it even stipulated what kinds of tools people were allowed to use. So black people were allowed to use tools that you would use for repairing roads and making roads manually and for digging gold out of rocks.
So it was that level of detail in terms
I
of...
promise you, they weren't, for example, they weren't allowed to lay bricks. They weren't allowed to use the trowel to lay bricks. That was reserved for white people.
That's fascinating.
And actually, gosh, I wish I'd thought of checking the date, but I think it was around, in the 1920s, around about 1923, there was a big strike of white mine workers striking around the question of job reservation, that, the jobs should not be opened up on the mines for black people. So that job reservation, Lezli, was hugely important because you must know after the Anglo-Boer War, the South African War, Afrikaners were very, very, very poor.
Afrikaners were poor, but the British were not.
No, they had the whole empire behind them.
Right. Okay. Got it. Okay.
I mean, the Afrikaners were local people, if I can put it that way. Like their farms had been burnt to the ground and stuff like that. So they were really, really poor. And that job reservation is what gave Afrikaners that really big leg up. So, it didn't matter what your education level was. As long as you were white, you were guaranteed a job, whether it was in mining or on the railways, in the railway system or whatever, you would get a job because black people could not compete with you.
Right, because even if you were mediocre, I have job reservation.
That's right. And you really could be very, very mediocre, believe me.
So you told us about Rip Van Winkle. You told us, a few personal things. It is 25 plus years since the first free elections. Exactly, I think 26 years since Mandela was elected president. How would you say your worldview has changed?
For me personally, I'm a completely different person. I mean, I wouldn't even like my young self if I met her.
That is so profound.
I would not like her. I would have empathy for her because I'd understand this is socialization, but I would not like her. I wouldn't want to bother to spend time with her. But I'm probably not the most typical white South African. For many people hold on to that, a lot of that sense of resentment and still holding on to the narratives of the apocalypse that's coming. And they spread all these stories about how, farmers are being murdered at such a pace and it's a white genocide.
I've seen those. Yes. I've seen those, that Afrikaner farmers are being murdered.
Yes, that's right. And of course, the farm murders do happen. No question about that. But the murder rates in impoverished black areas are much, much higher. That's just part of that imagination that spins that narrative. So my late husband is coloured, although he was not my first husband.
Okay.
But my late husband was coloured and he was a leader in the African National Congress in exile, Red September. So it is a very different background. I mean, we really did come from very different backgrounds, as you can imagine. But because in that community, the coloured community is where you would get the most sort of like crossing through these racial categories, because a lot of people would try to be white, as they would put it. And so people would want to be classified up the hierarchy, as it were. As you rightfully read, no white people became black. So that was the sort of the categorization in which you had the most fluidity. But my late husband's older sister married a white Afrikaans guy who worked on the railways or something like that. And if her own friends, if people from her community came to visit and they saw her father, if he came into the house or whatever, she would tell them that's her gardener, her own father. And I promise you, she would actually lock her own children into a cupboard while the white friends were there so that they would not see that her children actually were darker.
Oh, my goodness.
So I want to tell you that the violence that racial categorization involved is just unspeakable. And what's so ridiculous is all of this, the social construction of race, was based on these narratives that this is nature, it's natural that we belong to these different racial groups. But we don't come out of nature in racial groups, because in South Africa, you can absolutely see how hard the society had to work to keep these boundaries.
And the amount of money I'm sure they had to put into it. They had an office of racial classification. They had a this or that.
Lezli, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I will tell you that if we had put the amount of money that went into the oppression of Black people, into the development of Black people in our country, we would be a completely unrecognizable place. Unrecognizable. The amount of money and energy and work that went into keeping these racial categorizations intact was
unbelievable. It's
inestimable what it has done to us. Yeah.
So your book was written in 2001. It's 2022. Whiteness isn't what it used to be. One of the things I didn't mention about you, you're not a typical South African by any means. In addition to everything that I read in the bio, you're also an expert in critical whiteness studies.
Yes, that's the field, yes.
What does it now mean to be a white woman in South Africa today, or to be white in South Africa today?
So you see, it's difficult because, as I say, it depends so much how you position yourself in relation to what is unfolding. It is true that if you look at white South Africans who have stayed in the country compared with those who left the country, and you must know we have a steady exodus of white people, which is not unique to South Africa. That has happened in all colonial settings, that white people generally do not stay in contexts where they don't control the state. They move back to places where there's a white government, or mostly white government. But if you compare the people who have stayed here, there's a definite way in which the tide moves people along, and certainly people have adjusted, people have learnt a lot. But you have, for some white women who would be positioned within the more like right side of the political spectrum, those people are filled with a lot of anxiety still, but also resentment and this feeling that they're besieged, and that there's sort of like the context is malicious towards their interests. I suppose if you're a white woman there, that's very different. But there's also, I think, a lot of people for whom the liberation of South Africa also was the liberation for them as white women and, for example, as gay men, gay people generally.
Why was the end of apartheid liberating for gay people?
Because policing the country racially involved policing sexuality very closely.
You're right, yeah.
So, I mean, there was so many laws and taboos around sexual behaviors. We still had all those sodomy laws and everything, you know. So our constitution was very enlightened, and it created baselines that secured the entitlement to be yourself along all these different axes that before had been policed in that very oppressive kind of way. So for many other white women, there's also been a lot of changes. I mean, when I was teaching in the old apartheid as a married woman, I wasn't allowed to have a permanent job in the teaching profession because I was supposed to have a husband who was providing for me. As a married white woman, you could only have a temporary job.
That's fascinating to me that there would even still be some women who are resentful that apartheid ended. They should see that it helped them as well.
You know, you would think, but some people are very trapped in these sort of racial ways of interpreting the world. What can one say about that? You know, but I did want to say that those apartheid laws were repealed, some of them in the very late 1980s into the 1990s, but then most particularly after 1994. There was quite a systematic attempt to go through all the laws of the country and undo the colonial and apartheid texts.
There are so many things that are just like commonplace for you. But as you talk about them, I'm like, wait a minute, go back. I don't understand what you mean. You know what I mean? It's just like hearing things, obviously, segregation, stratification, all of these things happened any place that colonialism touched. But it's very interesting to hear it from a context that is not from the United States. So, I'm just so glad that we got to have this conversation. It's amazing.
It's my great pleasure.
So I have one last question, and we ask all of our guests this. It's your last night on Earth. Where are you eating?
Oh.
You can interpret that any way you want.
Oh, I'm going to eat at home where I've got my little doggy. And if it's the last night, we're definitely spending it together.
Oh. Thank you for listening to Impolite Conversation, the podcast, curated by the Iconoclast Dinner Experience. You can follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Icon Dinner and on the Iconoclast Dinner Experience Facebook page. Let us know what you thought about this episode. Hit us on socials or send us feedback at press@iconoclastdinner.com. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to our podcast, and we'd also love it if you rated and reviewed us.